This story is a work of fiction. All characters, names, and events are entirely imaginary, created for entertainment purposes only. There was a document. It rested at the center of a long mahogany table, unassuming in its size and devastating in its implications. A single sheaf of parchment, folded twice, sealed in dark crimson wax bearing the Devereux crest, a hawk with wings half spread, caught between rising and resting. The wax was old. It had been pressed into softness months ago in a room in Brussels that smelled of camphor and wood smoke, and the particular anxiety of a man writing what he expected to be his final instructions to the living. The parchment had yellowed slightly at the edges. The ink was dark and even, the handwriting controlled in a way that costs effort to maintain, the hand of a man who was not well and had decided not to let that show. 12 gentlemen in that room knew the document existed. They had been calculating its contents since September, when word came from the continent that Cassian Henry Devereux, 7th Duke of Devereux, was not expected to survive his wounds. 12 men had been very patient and very polite to one another for 3 months while they waited for that seal to be broken. They had attended dinners. They had inquired after one another's estates. They had not spoken directly about the thing they were all thinking, because gentlemen in England in 1815 understood that the performance of patience was itself a form of strategy. Not one of them had calculated for her. What becomes of a secret that a dying man wrote into law? In the autumn of 1815, a room full of calculating gentlemen held very still, while a solicitor's careful voice read aloud what a duke had decided in private. And in the corner, dressed in plain black wool, sat the woman none of them had counted. She had no title, no fortune, no family name worth mentioning in that company. She had spent 2 years believing the man who had changed everything for her was never coming back. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about nearly everything. But she was right about one thing, and it would take the reading of a will, a confrontation on a staircase, a night of ultimatum she refused to accept, and one cold morning in a small park before she could say it aloud. Before we begin this story, tell me where you are tonight, the city, the hour, whether the window beside you shows rain or stars, or the quiet dark of a street grown still. Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. The waiting room of Devereux House was smaller than the rooms Leonora had come to know during her 3 years of employment there, and colder than any of them had been when the late Duchess was alive. It had been used for storage, trunks with rusted latches, painting frames wrapped in cloth, the kind of furniture deemed not quite good enough for the public rooms, but too serviceable to part with. Someone had cleared it hastily and placed 2 chairs near the window. A small fire had been laid in the grate, barely enough for the size of the room. It gave off the smell of dust catching heat, and something underneath it, the particular damp of a space that had been shut up too long. Leonora occupied one of the chairs. The other remained empty. She had not been told why she was summoned. The letter had arrived 4 days prior, written by Mr. Phineas Halcourt in the formal, measured script of a man who chose his words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. It addressed her as Miss Ashworth. It requested her presence at Devereux House on the 14th of November at 10:30 o'clock, regarding a matter pertaining to the late Duke's will. Nothing further. Nothing that explained what connection she, a woman who had been employed as a companion and was employed no longer, could have to a document governing one of the oldest dukedoms in England. She had read it twice, and then set it on the small desk in the corner of the cousin's parlour, and looked at it for a while, as if looking long enough might cause it to explain itself. She told herself she was calm. She held her hands folded in her lap, and looked at the grey November light pressing against the window glass, and kept her breathing even. This was a skill she had practiced over 3 years at Devereux House, and over the 7 months since she had left it, and over the 2 years before that during which she had tried and failed and eventually succeeded in convincing herself that what she felt for the Duke was something she could simply decide not to feel. She had made it a project, that convincing, steady, methodical, conducted in the quiet hours when she read or walked or lay awake, and she had achieved it, more or less, except on the particular occasions when she had not. She was better at some skills than others. Through the wall she could hear the low, indistinct sound of male voices. Not the words, the rhythm only, the kind of conversation men conduct when something material is at stake, and they are all performing the virtue of patience while calculating quite rapidly behind their eyes. She thought without meaning to of Cassian. She had received the news in July, forwarded by the cousin whose townhouse she now occupied as a temporary arrangement. The Duke of Devereux had been gravely wounded at Waterloo. His recovery was uncertain. He had been transported to Brussels and then to a house outside Calais where surgeons had attended him. In September came word that his survival was no longer assured. In October came silence, which meant something specific, even if the confirming letter had not yet arrived. She had not cried. She had sat very still at the window of her small borrowed room and felt something inside her chest rearrange itself into a shape that left no space for tears. Outside, the street had continued in its ordinary way. A cart, a woman with a parasol, a dog that paused and moved on. The world had no interest in the particular quality of what she was losing. She had known since the night before he left for the continent that she was not entitled to grieve him the way one grieves a person who was properly yours. She had known since that same night exactly how much she had lost without ever having been permitted to hold it. The door opened. One of Mr. Halcourt's clerks stood in the frame, young with the careful, neutral expression of a man who has been specifically trained not to show curiosity. "Miss Ashworth, they are ready for you." She stood, smoothed the front of her dress, plain black wool bought when the Duchess died, still the most appropriate thing she owned, and followed him into the hall, her footsteps quiet on the stone floor, her hands at her sides. The room they led her into was at the back of the house, past the staircase that rose to the upper floors, behind a door of dark panelled wood. It opened onto a space long enough to accommodate the mahogany table, the 12 chairs ranged around it, and at the far end a fireplace burning with exactly the amount of fuel required to prevent the room from being noticeably cold without providing anything as excessive as warmth. A pair of portraits looked down from the walls, 2 Devereux men of previous generations, both with the family's sharp jaw and the hazel eyes that ran in the line. Leonora did not look at them for long. The men were already seated. She recognized some of them, Lord Hugo Ingram, the Duke's cousin on the Devereux side, who had a quality of compressed waiting about him that she had never liked. Mr. Aldous Fenwick, the family's man of business, who wore an expression of anxious neutrality that was probably professional habit. 2 others she placed as distant relations by their resemblance to the portraits. The rest were strangers to her. They were all dressed in the sober colors of men attending a legal proceeding, and they all turned to look at her when she entered. Not with hostility, that would come later, though she did not know this yet. With the particular blankness of men who are recalibrating. She was younger than they had perhaps expected, or plainer in her dress, or simply present in a way that had not been factored into their calculations. She took the chair indicated by the clerk at the foot of the table, and set her hands in her lap and looked at Mr. Halcourt, who stood at the head with the sealed document before him. "Shall we proceed?" he said. It was not a question. He broke the seal. The sound of it was small in the room, the faint snap of old wax, the rustle of parchment unfolding. The reading of a will is a slow ceremony when the estate is large. There are formalities to observe, clauses within clauses, the language of law folding back on itself in careful Latin phrases and archaic English constructions designed to leave as little room for ambiguity as possible. Mr. Halcourt had a dry, unhurried voice suited to the task. He had been reading documents in this house for 30 years, and he brought to it the quality of a man who understood that what he read was not his to react to, only to convey. Leonora listened, and caught the shape of it well enough. The entailed estate, the titles, the properties in 3 counties, the investments, the obligations regarding dependents, all as expected to Cassian Henry Devereux, 7th Duke of Devereux, or in the event of his death to the male heir of his body, or failing that to the nearest male relation of the direct line. Hugo's hands on the table surface were very still. She watched them from the corner of her vision, the controlled stillness of someone doing arithmetic in their head, and not yet having arrived at a figure they liked. Then Mr. Halcourt paused. He turned a page. His expression did not change. He was the kind of man whose expression had been trained over decades not to change. "I come now," he said, to a codicil appended to this document in the Duke's own hand, dated the 22nd of June 1815, witnessed by Captain Frederick Langham and one Thomas Briggs, Sergeant, and bearing the signature of Cassian Henry Devereux in his capacity as 7th Duke of Devereux. A different quality of silence settled over the room. The fire in the grate shifted. No one moved. Mr. Halcourt read. He read slowly and without inflection, which was the only kindness available to him. He read that Cassian Henry Devereux, in full understanding of his obligations and in sound mind despite his circumstances, did hereby bequest to Miss Leonora Jane Ashworth, formerly of Devereux House, London, his personal fortune of £42,000, held in account separate from the entailed estate, together with the unentailed house in Portland Street and the contents thereof as they stood at the time of his death. Furthermore, if Miss Ashworth should agree, within 1 year of his return to England alive and in her own unmarried person, to enter into the state of matrimony with himself, the terms of the Devereux entail regarding succession were to be considered fulfilled in anticipation, and all further provisions regarding succession to Lord Hugo Ingram or any other party were to be considered void. He set the page down. The room held its collective breath for exactly 3 seconds. Then Hugo Ingram said very quietly, "Read that again." Mr. Halcourt did. He read it with the same precision, every word as it had been the first time, the date in the margin clear and undeniable. 22nd of June, 1815, 2 days before Waterloo. Leonora was looking at the table, at a small imperfection in the wood grain, a knot the size of her thumbnail, pale against the dark, polished surface. She was aware of several things at once, that the room had shifted in some irreversible way, that the men around her were performing a rapid and deeply unpleasant internal calculation, that her hands in her lap had tightened to the point of discomfort, and that something in her chest which had arranged itself into stillness over 4 months was now moving again, searching for the shape it was meant to take. He had written her name into law. 2 days before Waterloo. She did not look up. She was not ready to look up. She needed a moment more before she was capable of meeting 12 pairs of eyes and showing them nothing they could use. Hugo said, "Is it valid?" He was addressing Halcourt, not her. He had not looked at her directly since she walked in. "Perfectly," Halcourt said, with the mild authority of a man who has answered this question before and will answer it exactly as many times as it is asked. "The codicil meets all legal requirements. It was witnessed by 2 parties, signed by the Duke in his own hand, appended to the primary document before the sealing. It is binding." Someone across the table said, with the air of a man contributing what seems useful, "He may yet survive." This was directed at Hugo, not at her. "He may," Halcourt agreed, "in which case the question of Miss Ashworth's intentions becomes the relevant matter going forward." Everyone in the room looked at her then. Leonora raised her head. She met each gaze in turn briefly and said nothing because there was nothing to say, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that anything she said would be used. She did not yet know what her intentions were. She was still managing the full weight of the fact that a man who had never said a direct word to her about what he felt had written her name into the most binding document the law permits, 2 days before a battle he had not expected to survive. The room felt smaller than it had when she entered. She left as soon as Mr. Halcourt indicated her presence was no longer required. There were formalities remaining, papers to sign, a date to be communicated for a further meeting. But the clerk handled these with the efficient consideration of a man who had been briefed and understood that the fewer people she had to speak to at this particular moment, the better for everyone. She signed what was placed before her. She answered questions with the minimum number of words required. She accepted a card with the clerk's address and placed it in her reticule without looking at it. She needed to leave the house. The hall was empty when she stepped into it, which was a grace she had not anticipated. The voices from behind the closed door of the reading room were audible, lower now and quicker, and carrying the specific texture of men in genuine discomfort who are attempting not to raise their voices at one another in a public space. Hugo Ingram's was the easiest to distinguish. The particular pitch of a man who has been running a very long calculation, and has just discovered that it doesn't add up to what he expected. The front door was 20 steps ahead of her. She could see the light from the transom window above it, the November grey pressing through the glass. She counted 15 of those steps before she stopped. She stopped because of the sound from the staircase. One footstep, and then another after that. Slow, deliberate, carrying the particular weight of a person managing something. She turned before she had fully decided to, and looked up. He was at the top of the staircase. He was using a cane in his right hand, which he had not been using the last time she saw him, and he was thinner than he had been. She could see that, even at this distance. The particular colour of sustained illness had not yet left his face, a quality of pallor that was not weakness but evidence. He was dressed in dark civilian clothes, and his hair was shorter, and he was looking at her directly, with an expression she had catalogued across 3 years without ever allowing herself to name. Cassian Henry Devereux was not dead. He was looking at her in the way she remembered him looking at her across rooms he had passed through on his way somewhere else. That quality of arrival, as if whatever else he had been doing was only a preliminary, and this here was the point. She had spent 2 years convincing herself she had imagined that quality. She could see now, with absolute clarity, that she had not imagined it. It had always been real. She had simply refused to believe in it. She did not move. He descended. It took longer than it once would have. She was aware of this, and she did not look away. He came down each step with care, the cane finding each tread before his right foot followed, and she stood very still at the bottom and watched him come, because to look away felt like a form of dishonesty she was not capable of. Not here, not now, not after 2 years, 7 months, and 4 days. He stopped on the second step from the bottom. This put them almost level. His hazel eyes, which she had thought about more times in 2 years than she would admit to any living person, were looking back at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not careful. He had always been careful, in her experience of him. Careful in a way that required visible effort, that had its own texture of suppression, of something held back by the strength of sustained decision. This was not that. Whatever he was doing now, it was not management. He said, "You stayed." She said, "I was summoned." "I know." A pause. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, not yet. "I asked Halcourt to summon you." She had understood this at some level from the moment Halcourt's clerk had knocked at the cousin's door 4 days ago, but hearing it from him was different. It moved through her in a way she had not braced for. She looked at his hands. His left gripped the banister with more force than he likely intended to show. The right held the cane. Both were steady. "You were supposed to be dying," she said. "I know. I am sorry about the uncertainty." "That is not what I meant." "I know that either." The voices behind the reading room door continued their low, rapid exchange. She was aware of how long they had been standing in the hall, and how this would appear to anyone who opened that door, and she found she did not particularly care, which was new to her and not entirely unwelcome. She said, "Why?" He knew exactly what she was asking. She had not needed to qualify it. He said, "I wrote the codicil in Brussels before I knew whether the surgeons would be right. I wrote it because there were things I should have said before I left England, and I had not said them. I decided that if I could not say them in person, if the occasion did not present itself, then perhaps I could say them in the only language I had left available." He paused. "I am aware that this is unconventional. It is rather more than unconventional." "Yes." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The hall was quiet except for the fire in the grate at the end of the passage, and the muffled voices behind the reading room door, and the sound of her own breathing, which she was working to make unremarkable. "We cannot speak of this here," she said. "No," he agreed, "but we will." She left the house. She walked quickly for approximately 2 streets before she stopped on the pavement. A hackney coach passed and sent a spray of cold water from the gutter over the curbstone. A flower seller on the corner glanced at her without particular interest and looked back at her basket. The grey November sky sat overhead in its impartial way, offering nothing. Her hands were trembling slightly, a fine internal tremor, not visible unless someone were looking closely. She was aware of it the way she was aware of her own heartbeat. Undeniable, inconvenient, and not something she could think away. Cassian Devereux was alive. He was alive, and he had looked at her from a staircase as if she were the reason he had bothered to survive. She started walking again. The last time she had seen him before today was the 14th of June, 1813. She knew the date because she had verified it twice in the intervening period. Once in the early months when she was still permitting herself to think about it, and once last winter when she had made a deliberate decision to stop and had needed to know the exact number of days she was committing to putting behind her. 2 years, 7 months, 4 days. He had come into the library at 8:30 in the evening, which was unusual. The library was his mother's province in the evenings, Leonora's for reading aloud, the Duchess's for the pleasure of being read to. A ritual they had established in the first months of Leonora's employment and maintained with the comfortable regularity of something that has found its right shape. The Duchess had been unwell that spring, less able to get about the house, grateful for the small constancy of it. Leonora would sit in the chair to the left of the fire, close enough that the firelight fell across the page, and read in a steady, unhurried voice, while the Duchess sat across from her in the wing-backed chair with the faded silk upholstery and a cup of something warm going cold at her elbow. They had been reading The Castle of Otranto, which the Duchess chose on grounds that Gothic novels were rather bracing for the constitution. The room smelled that evening of wood smoke and old paper, and the faint lavender sachets the housekeeper placed in the bookshelves. The fire was burning well. The candles on the mantelpiece threw a warm, uneven light across the nearest shelves and left the corners of the room in comfortable dark. Cassian had not come into the library at 8:30 in the evening. She had looked up when the door opened. He had stopped just inside, one hand on the doorframe, and she had seen by his face that something had changed since dinner. He had been at dinner, controlled and quiet in his usual fashion, asking his mother the right questions, fielding his aunt's commentary on the war with the patient brevity of a man who has had this conversation too many times. He had not looked at Leonora directly at dinner. He rarely did. They both understood the reasons for this, and had maintained the understanding with the particular mutual courtesy of people who are both aware of something they have agreed not to name. "Forgive me," he had said from the doorframe. "I came to say goodbye. We leave tomorrow at 5. Tomorrow at my team." The Duchess had reached for his hand and held it, both of hers around his one, and said something low and direct in the way she managed difficult things, brisk, affectionate, not sentimental, because sentiment in her view helped no one, and she had always preferred the truth. He had answered her, equally direct, equally without sentiment, and they had looked at each other in the way of two people who love each other and know how to show it without saying so. When the Duchess said she was tired and wished to retire, Leonora set down her book and rose to assist her. She settled the Duchess in her room, a matter of 20 minutes, the lamp adjusted, the fire banked, the nightcap and the small glass of warm milk that was never touched, but always requested. She was careful and quiet, and she did not think, during those 20 minutes, about anything except what she was doing. Cassian was still standing by the window when she came back into the library. She had expected him to be gone. He was looking at the street below, his back to the room, and he turned when he heard the door. She stopped near the writing desk. The fire had settled lower. The candles burned steadily. The room felt larger than it was, in the particular way of rooms at night when the dark beyond the windows creates the impression of infinite space pressing in. "Good night, Your Grace," she had said. "The right thing, the safe thing." He said, "Leonora, not Miss Ashworth." Her given name, which he used perhaps 4 times in the course of 3 years, each occasion leaving its small, indelible mark in ways she had no means of preventing. She looked at him. He was looking back. His face held the expression she had catalogued across 3 years without permitting herself to name it. Open in a way that cost him something to maintain, present in a way he did not usually allow himself to be. His hands were at his sides. A muscle in his jaw was tight. "When I come back—" He had stopped. She waited. The fire gave a small sound. A log settled with a soft collapse of itself. The street outside was quiet. "I should not—" He stopped again. He looked at the window and then back at her. and she had seen in his face the effort of a man trying very hard to be honorable, and finding in that moment the terms of honor considerably more restrictive than he had previously understood them to be. She said nothing. She was aware, with the clarity that arrives sometimes at moments of cost, of exactly what she was doing. She knew, with the particular unwelcome precision of someone who knows themselves too well, that if she said anything, if she moved, if she gave him the slightest indication that she was not going to maintain the fiction, that they were only what the terms of their situation required them to be, he would say whatever he was trying not to say. And then they would both have to live with having said it. He would go to the continent, carrying something open and unresolved. She would remain in the house, employed, with no means, and no family, and no other home, carrying something she had no right to carry. She maintained the fiction. "Good night, Miss Ashworth," he had said. He had not moved from the window. He had said it quietly, looking at her, and then he had left the room. She had stood in the library for a long time after the door closed. The fire burned. The candles burned. Outside, the street remained its ordinary self. She had her hand on the spine of the book she had not picked back up, the leather worn smooth at the binding from years of handling, warm from the fire's proximity. She had understood in that room that she had made a choice, a considered, deliberate choice. She had decided that certain things were not possible, and that acknowledging what was not possible served no purpose except a particular kind of suffering. She had been very rational about it. She had been, she thought, quite admirable about it. She had not anticipated spending 2 years, 7 months, and 4 days wondering whether she had been wrong. The note arrived at 7 o'clock in the evening, delivered to the door of the cousins' townhouse by a Devereux footman who declined to wait for a reply. Lady Constance Devereux, it said, would call upon Miss Ashworth at 9 that evening and hoped to find her at home. The phrase "hoped to find her" was doing a great deal of work, given that it was not phrased as a request. Leonora did not change her dress. She sat in the small parlour with a book she was not reading, and a fire that was not quite adequate for the room, and waited, and listened to the coal settling in the grate, and thought, without meaning to, about a staircase. Lady Constance arrived at 9 precisely, which was itself a kind of statement. She was a handsome woman of 52, dressed in the kind of mourning that communicated dignity rather than grief, the cut too deliberate, the fabric too fine, the posture too unchanged. She had the quality of a woman who had learned very early in life that the appearance of warmth was considerably more useful than its substance. She declined tea without looking at it. She took the chair by the window and looked at Leonora with an expression of measured sympathy that was, on close examination, its own form of pressure. "My dear Miss Ashworth," she said, "what a complicated day this has been for everyone." "Yes, my lady." "I imagine it has been considerably more complicated for you than for most of us." A pause, calibrated to the second. "You had no idea, I take it, that my nephew had made such arrangements?" "None at all." "No, of course not." Lady Constance folded her hands in her lap. Her rings caught the firelight, a ruby, 2 diamonds, a pearl the colour of old bone. It is the sort of gesture that is very Cassian in a certain light, generous without intending to be practical. He feels things quite deeply, you know. He simply rarely permits himself to act on what he feels. Leonora did not reply. She had noticed that Lady Constance had not asked whether Leonora shared any of those feelings. She had framed the codicil as the action of a solitary man, without consideration for what might be on the other side of it. "The difficulty," Lady Constance continued, "is that what might perhaps be excused as a private sentiment becomes rather more problematic when it is a public document. The codicil will be discussed. These things always are, regardless of the solicitor's discretion, and once it is known, well, I think you are intelligent enough to know what is said about a woman whose name appears in a duke's will under such circumstances." "I believe I do, my lady." "I suspected you would." Lady Constance opened her reticule and removed an envelope, which she placed on the small table between them with the quiet precision of a move in a game. "I would not wish your reputation to suffer for my nephew's impulsiveness. This represents £500 drawn from my own private account. No estate funds involved, no legal complication. It is offered as a gesture of gratitude for your loyal service to this family, and in the hope that you might find it sufficient to establish yourself comfortably in some part of the country where the season's gossip does not reach quite so efficiently." The envelope sat on the table between them. Leonora looked at it. She looked at the way the firelight moved across the folded paper, the dark wax seal, the expensive texture of the stationery. £500 was a considerable sum to a woman without income. She was aware of this. She was quite certain Lady Constance was aware of it too. She was also aware, in the way one becomes aware of the architecture of a place one has been in before, that this was a room with only one door, and Lady Constance was standing between her and it. She reached out and picked up the envelope. Something in Lady Constance's shoulders shifted. Not much, the fractional release of a woman whose calculation has proved accurate. Leonora turned the envelope over in her hands once, felt the weight of it, and set it back on Lady Constance's side of the table. She said, "That is very kind, my lady. I am not able to accept." Lady Constance looked at the envelope and then at her. "May I ask why not?" "Because I cannot accept the premise on which it is offered." Leonora met her eyes without difficulty. "I have not yet decided what I intend to do. It seems to me that I cannot be recompensed for a decision I have not yet made." "You are proposing to wait." "I am proposing to think." The silence stretched. Lady Constance had a way of making silence into a form of pressure. Leonora had observed this across 3 years of dinners and morning calls and the particular social machinery of a great house. She had also spent 3 years learning to sit in that silence without filling it with something she would regret. "The estate requires an heir," Lady Constance said. Her voice had changed very slightly. The silk surface was thinner now, revealing something harder underneath. "My nephew's responsibilities in this regard are considerable. A duke requires a wife of appropriate standing. Whatever private feelings may have influenced the codicil, they do not alter the material facts." "No," Leonora agreed. "They do not." "Then you understand—" "I understand my lady's position." She rose. "I also understand my own. If I have anything to communicate regarding this matter, I will do so through Mr. Halcourt." Lady Constance stood as well. She retrieved the envelope from the table without comment. She said in the tone of a woman delivering something she has prepared in advance, "Miss Ashworth, you are sensible enough to know that a duke does not marry his mother's companion. Whatever Cassian wrote in Brussels, that fact remains. I hope you will allow it to guide you." "Good night, my lady," Leonora said. She rang for the maid, who appeared promptly, and showed Lady Constance out. Leonora stood in the middle of the parlour after the sound of the carriage faded from the street, and felt, not anger precisely. Anger was too clean for it. Something older than anger. Something she had been carrying in various forms since the year her father's debts became general knowledge, and the world rearranged itself into people who saw her and people who saw what she came from. She sat back down. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. The knuckles, the ink stain on her right forefinger from a letter she had written that morning. The small scar on her left thumb from a dropped letter opener 3 years ago, in a room she had been sitting in because she was paid to be there. She thought about the choices she had made to arrive at this particular moment, and which of them she would change if she could, and which of them she would not. Then she went to bed. She did not sleep. He learned about his aunt's visit at 7 o'clock the following morning. This was because Mr. Halcourt's junior clerk, a conscientious young man named Gideon Pryor, had been in the habit of walking early to Devereux House with documents, and had been doing exactly this the previous evening, when he observed Lady Constance's carriage departing the cousin's address with a certain purposeful haste. He mentioned it to Halcourt. Halcourt called on the Duke at an hour that violated every convention of morning calls, and told him what he had observed and what he had surmised. Cassian listened without moving from the chair where he had been sitting since before 6, which was itself information, though he did not reflect on it. When Halcourt finished, he said, "What did she bring?" "I cannot confirm the precise nature." Halcourt said carefully, "An envelope." Miss Ashworth declined to accept it. Cassian set his hand flat on the arm of the chair. He was aware of the familiar ache in his right leg, not something he particularly noticed any longer. It had been constant enough since July to have become simply a background condition of existing, like the sounds of the street or the weight of the air in a closed room. He was aware of the fire in the grate and the grey morning pressing at the window, and the very specific quality of a man who has been insufficiently direct at every critical moment and is now confronting the compounded results all at once. He said, "Thank you, Halcourt, you may go." He called for his coat. His man helped him dress with the efficient silence they had developed in the month since Brussels, when the process had been considerably more complicated and required considerably more patience from both of them. He took his cane. He descended the stairs with the care that would have irritated him 6 months ago. A manageable thing now, the irritation, something he had decided was not a useful expenditure of energy when there were better ones available. Lady Constance breakfasted late. He found her in the morning room at 8:30, with tea going cold and a letter she was not reading, and she had the expression of a woman who had expected, at some level, to be found. She did not look surprised, she looked watchful, which was not the same thing. He sat down opposite her. This was an assertion. He was not arriving to exchange pleasantries and leave. He said, "I would like you to tell me exactly what you said to Miss Ashworth last evening." She began with the measured warmth she kept in reserve for managing him. "Cassian, I acted entirely in the family's—" "I know what you acted in. I would like to know what you said." She told him. She had the intelligence to tell him truthfully, or nearly so. He had always been able to identify the difference in 30 years of knowing her. She laid out her reasoning as she spoke, and her reasoning was not without internal logic. He understood the calculus she had applied, had even at certain dark points in Brussels applied it to himself. He listened with the quality of attention he had learned in the field for situations where the right response was not the immediate one. When she finished, he said, "I want to ask you something, and I would like an honest answer." She set down her teacup. He said, "At what point did you decide that what was in that codicil was something to be managed rather than something to be respected?" A pause. "My dear, you were gravely wounded. The codicil was written under duress." "At what point?" She looked at him. Something shifted in her face. Not quite regret, but the acknowledgement of a calculation that has been made and is now being examined by someone she had not expected to be examining it. The codicil represents an impulse formed under considerable physical and emotional extremity. It does not represent, it represents exactly what I intended it to represent. He kept his voice level, and even the same voice he had used for orders in the field that required no debate. I wrote it in full possession of my senses, which 2 witnesses will confirm. I wrote it because I had spent 3 years being incapable of plain speech, and had decided that if I did not do something legally binding about it, I never would. He stopped. Then, "You will not approach Miss Ashworth again regarding this matter. You will not communicate with her directly or through any other party. Whatever she decides, she will decide without interference from this family." He stood. His aunt said quietly, "And if she decides against you?" He reached for the cane. He looked at her for a moment. "Then she decides against me," he said, "and that is her right, as it has always been." He left the morning room. He was not entirely certain where she would be. He had thought about this with methodical attention over the past 20 hours, the way he approached problems that admitted only one right answer, but required patience to find. He knew the cousin's address. He knew the pattern of her mornings, assembled across 3 years of careful observation. He had been far too cautious to acknowledge as observation at the time. He knew that when she had something to reckon with, she walked, and when walking was insufficient, she found somewhere still and sat in it until the thing inside her had resolved itself into something she could look at directly. He had never been shown the small park behind Devereux House, but he had seen them return from it in the early months of her employment. His mother's colour better than it had been before, both of them quiet in the way of people who have been somewhere that suited them. He went there first. She was sitting on the bench closest to the hornbeam hedge at the back of the park, where the stone wall blocked the wind. She was wearing her black coat and dark gloves, and she had a pale envelope in her lap that she was not looking at. She was looking at the oak tree at the park's centre, old, broad, its bare branches spread against the November sky in the specific, unpretentious way of a tree that has outlasted a great deal and expects to outlast considerably more. The frost had not entirely left the ground. Where the sun had not yet reached, the grass held its white edges. The park was empty. A pigeon occupied itself in the dead leaves near the path. Somewhere beyond the wall, the street conducted its ordinary business. He crossed the grass. She heard him coming. The cane marked each step on the frost-edged ground with a clear, deliberate sound, and she turned her head and watched him approach. She did not stand. She did not arrange her expression. She simply looked at him coming across the grass toward her, and her face showed whatever it showed, which she did not attempt to manage. He sat down beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The pigeon shuffled something in the leaves. The hornbeam hedge moved in a gust of wind and then settled. The cold had the smell of mineral things, stone and frozen earth, and the faint char of coal smoke drifting from somewhere beyond the wall. He said, "My aunt brought you an envelope." She said, "She did. You gave it back." "I did." He looked at the envelope in her lap. Plainer than Lady Constance's, smaller. A letter rather than a banker's draft. "What is that?" she said. "My cousin's address. I was considering whether to leave London." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Were you considering it because you wanted to, or because it seemed like the option that required the least of you?" She looked at him. He looked back steadily. She said, "That is not a fair question." "I know. I'm also not in a particularly fair position at this moment." He shifted slightly on the bench, adjusting the leg to a more comfortable angle, a small, practical motion, entirely without self-consciousness. "I would like to say something. I have been attempting to say it for several years, and I have been consistently prevented by the better part of my judgment, which kept presenting me with the relevant considerations. I would like to say it now before my better judgment reasserts itself, which it will because it is very persistent." Something in her face changed, a slight movement at the corner of her mouth, a quality of attention that she usually distributed more evenly over everything. She said, "Say it then." "It." He said, "I left England in June of 1813 without telling you that I had spent the previous 2 years cataloguing, against my own best intentions, every single thing about you that I had no right to be cataloguing. The way you managed my mother's moods without her knowing they were being managed. The way you argued with Mr. Hargrove about Cowper in the library, and then apologized for arguing, and then, over the following week, quietly proved you were right. The way you laughed when you thought no one was watching, which is differently shaped from how you laugh in company. The way you held your hands in your lap in that particular position during any meal at which my aunt was present." He was looking at the oak tree as he spoke, at the bare branches spread against the grey sky, and his voice was level and unhurried. "I went to the continent. I wrote the codicil in Brussels not because of the surgeons, or not only. I wrote it because standing in that library the night before I left, I chose to be honourable, and I spent 2 years and 7 months understanding precisely what that choice cost both of us." The park held its cold, quiet breath. She said, "I let you." He turned to look at her. She said, "You were going to say something and I let you stop. I made that choice. I chose to maintain things as they were because I was afraid of what would happen if we changed them." Her hands were in her lap, the envelope between her fingers. "I was afraid that if I acknowledged what I felt, it would become impossible to stay. And staying it was the only place I had, the only house in 3 years that felt like something real." He said, "What are you afraid of now?" She considered the question honestly. She looked at the oak tree. She looked at the envelope in her lap, her cousin's address, a city she didn't know, a life arranged for her by her own determined reasonableness. She looked at what was actually in front of her, which she had been avoiding since the moment in the reading room yesterday, and felt the full specific weight of it. She said, "I am afraid of wanting things I am not supposed to want." He said, "What things, specifically?" She looked at him. He was looking back at her, not carefully, not with the control she had spent 3 years watching him maintain, as if it were a practice he could not afford to interrupt. He looked like a man who had made a decision somewhere between Brussels and this bench, and the decision was that he was finished with being careful. She said, "You." The word sat between them. The pigeon turned over a leaf on the path. The hornbeam hedge breathed in the wind and then was still. He reached over slowly and took the envelope from her lap. He turned it once in his hand and set it on the bench on his other side. Then he rested his left hand between them, open, palm up, not quite touching hers. She looked at his hand. She looked at the oak tree spreading its bare branches against the November sky, old, having outlasted a great deal, expecting to outlast considerably more. She thought, I am done with not wanting things. I have been done with it for a long time. I simply have not been willing to say so. She turned her hand over. His fingers closed around hers. The warmth of it moved through her glove, immediate and specific and entirely unlike anything she had managed to talk herself out of feeling for 2 years and 7 months. They sat on the bench in the small park behind Devereux House, while the November morning pressed its quiet grey light across the hedge, and the frost softened slowly in the grass, and the old oak stood against the sky as it had always stood, past all the calculating and the silence and the very reasonable fear, past the war and the codicil and the room full of men who had not once thought to count her among the relevant parties. When they stood to go, it was without discussion, simply the sense that they had said what needed saying, and that everything remaining could be attended to in the ordinary way, with time, with conversation, with the particular patience of two people who have waited long enough to understand the value of what they are no longer willing to sacrifice. She took his arm. He steadied his weight against the cane and against her, which she thought was more natural to him than he would have permitted a year ago or 2 years ago. He had learned something, she thought, in the month since Brussels. She had learned something in the month since his name stopped appearing in letters, the things people learn when they have taken stock of what they are willing to lose. They walked out of the park together. The gate was iron, painted black, slightly stiff from disuse. He held it open with one hand and she passed through first and then turned to wait for him, and he came through after, and they walked on. The street beyond was beginning its morning. A baker's cart moved along the far side, its horse patient in the cold, its driver hunched against the temperature with his hat pulled low. A woman with a basket moved quickly on the opposite pavement. From somewhere down the block came the sound of shutters being unlatched, a window thrown up, the ordinary morning sounds of a house waking. She thought, this is not how I expected anything to go. She thought, I am glad. Above the gate, as they passed under it, the linden trees in the park held their bare branches against the sky, dark lines on pale grey, precise and intricate and very old. She glanced up at them and then forward again. She was aware of the warmth of his arm under her hand, even through the layers of coat and glove. She was aware of the cold of the November air on her face, and the particular quality of the light that comes before rain, the sky not yet committing, and the sound of their footsteps on the pavement, which did not need to match but did, a fraction, because they were walking at the same unhurried pace. Cassian said, without looking at her, "We should probably speak to Halcourt." She said, "Yes, probably." A pause. Somewhere behind them, a dog barked twice and then was satisfied. He said, "Not today." She said, "No, not today." They walked on. The street opened ahead of them into the wider avenue, where the traffic was already moving, carriages, a dray, a man on horseback picking his way between them. The city in November, grey and particular, and entirely indifferent to anything that had been decided in a small park behind a house in the late morning light. She thought about 3 years of a house that smelled of beeswax and old paper and lavender. She thought about a library at 8:30, and a fire burning low, and a man standing by a window who had been about to say something and had not. She thought about the letter opener scar on her left thumb, and the ink stain on her right forefinger, and all the ordinary evidence of a life lived carefully, in borrowed spaces, on the terms available. She thought, those terms have changed. She thought, I'm not afraid of that. There is a particular kind of ending that does not announce itself. It simply arrives at the point where the story has reached its right shape, and nothing more needs to be added. A sealed document, broken open in a room full of men who had not counted her. A staircase and a man who was supposed to be dead looking at her with an expression she had spent 3 years refusing to name. A cold bench and an envelope set aside. and a hand turned over. And beyond the park gate, a November morning, a city going about its business, two people walking through it together without hurry, with nothing left to perform and nothing left to withhold. The shadows where romance lives.